Okay, so good morning, everybody, and let's continue our discussion about the endocrine system. And I finished off last time by telling you a little bit about the condition of diabetes. In that case, we saw if the pancreas failed to produce insulin, then the cells of the body are unable to take up glucose, and the cells effectively become totally starved of energy and will actually die. So what I described there was actually diabetes type 1, and that is congenital diabetes. That is diabetes which is either inherited or which develops very shortly after birth, often in infancy, as the cells of the pancreas are rendered unable to produce insulin for one reason or another. There can be various reasons why that occurs. But there is another kind of diabetes, which is a worldwide problem and a growing problem, in fact, particularly in developed countries. And it is a type of diabetes which is acquired. And this is diabetes type 2. It's also called non-insulin dependent diabetes. That is because it does not result from the pancreas failing to produce insulin. Instead, it results from the cells of the body being unable to perceive that insulin is present. You'll remember that insulin is released in response to a rise in blood glucose. And it causes all the cells of the body to open portals to glucose, to take glucose in, and for the liver to take glucose in and start to make glycogen. But if the cells of the body do not have those receptors, or the receptors are dysfunctional, and the cells cannot see that insulin is present, none of those effects will arise, no matter how much insulin the pancreas produces. And this is typical for diabetes type 2. Diabetes type 2 is acquired usually much later in life, and it is associated with lifestyle. In particular, it is associated with being overweight and lack of exercise, having a lack of exercise. It also associated with diets which are high in carbohydrate, sugars, and in fats. And in fact, lifestyle management, dietary management, and exercise management are the principal treatments for diabetes type 2. Just to show you how widespread a problem it is and where it is a particular problem, have a look at this map here. Look, first of all, you see this background yellow here. That's a background level of diabetes. This map shows you both types of diabetes. So this is diabetes worldwide, and it's both types of diabetes. This light yellow is the background level of diabetes type 1, which occurs throughout the human population and is not due to lifestyle or anything like that. This is congenital diabetes. And now have a look here at the developed countries, North America, Europe, especially southern Mediterranean here, and various other places with very, very high levels of development, where diet, for example, is very high in oils and sugars and this sort of thing. And you'll see that, especially have a look, North America is the capital of diabetes type 2. And this is largely because of poor dietary choice, unfortunately. So this really is a worldwide problem. And you'll see it in many, increasingly, for example, in Australia, as diet begins to change and away from a healthy diet, fruit, nuts, small amount of meat, and low sugar. That is a much more healthy diet. Okay, so now let's have a look now. We've seen some of the ways in which hormones are balanced and how they respond to negative feedback and everything else. We're going to now start talking about the real complexity that results from the control of the body by this area of the brain called the hypothalamus. There's the hypothalamus there. It's in the walls of the cerebral ventricle. So it's part of the brain tissue. It's neural tissue, but it is neurohormonal tissue. That is, it can, instead of simply producing a nerve impulse, the way other nerves do, the cells of the hypothalamus are able to release hormones. They produce sets of hormones, and different cells of the hypothalamus produce different types of hormone. In a very, very complex manner, the hypothalamus is continually monitoring the conditions of the body, especially of the blood passing through it. It monitors all sorts of things. It monitors the temperature. It monitors levels of hormones and substances continuously. And in response to what it sees, it releases hormones which have tremendously powerful effects. Many, many, many of the hormones of the hypothalamus, however, do not operate directly on the body. Instead, they operate through an intermediary, which is this little gland here, which is the pituitary gland. Close to the hypothalamus and closely connected with it, but very frequently we'll see hypothalamus will release hormones which have activity on the pituitary, and the pituitary then releases hormones which may operate directly on the body or may themselves then operate on another endocrine gland. And remember what I've told you, that when you see this kind of complexity in a biological system, what it implies is fine control. It means that the body is able to finely control how much hormone there is and how much effect is derived. Okay, so there's the hypothalamus here, pituitary below. They are very much what we're going to be talking about. So here's the hypothalamus, and here's the pituitary below it, and the pituitary gland actually is like two different glands. There is a posterior part and an anterior part, and they secrete different hormones. So they really are like two different glands sandwiched together. The pituitary operates under the control of the hypothalamus. It does not liberate hormone just on its own. It responds to instruction really from the hypothalamus. Now that's connection with the hypothalamus. There are two kinds, depending on which part of the pituitary you're talking about. The posterior pituitary here connects to the hypothalamus by long nerve cells, which are really a combination of nerve cell and secretory cell, and we call them the neurosecretory cells. And neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus secrete their hormones and move it down the axons all the way to the posterior pituitary, where it is then released into the bloodstream. So in this case, the posterior pituitary really is just like a highway for the hypothalamic hormones to be released. So they are produced all throughout the cells of the hypothalamus, and then they are moved down to the posterior pituitary, and they are released. There are two hormones to memorize. The first one here, it says ADH, that stands for anti-diuretic hormone. A diuretic is something which causes you to produce dilute urine. So an anti-diuretic is a hormone that gets your kidneys to take up liquid. So what happens is, in response to antidiuretic hormone, the kidneys very efficiently take up water and they put it into your bloodstream. So now just picture this. Your bloodstream is a set volume. If I put more water into the blood, I increase the blood volume. And what I'm going to do then is increase the blood pressure. And that is the principle. This is one of the principal functions of antidiuretic hormone and of the kidneys, is to regulate blood pressure by regulating blood volume. And that is in response to hormones from the hypothalamus released from the posterior pituitary. The other hormone which is released from the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. Now, oxytocin has many, many effects all over the body. And in particular, a particular physical effect is that it operates often on smooth muscle. So, for example, oxytocin is one of the hormones which is involved in enabling the smooth muscles of the breast to express milk. It's also involved with many other things like that. For example, it causes the uterine muscles to contract during labor. But oxytocin is a very, very interesting hormone because it is a hormone which is released in response to, very strongly released in response to psychological input. And they sometimes call it the loving hormone. Oxytocin is released, for example, when you get that the warm fuzzies, you see a baby or puppy or whatever, those kind of feelings of affection and everything else very strongly stimulate the release of oxytocin. And that's not surprising because you can imagine a mother looking at her child feeding at the breast, feels those feelings of warmth and affection and everything else, and it will cause the release of oxytocin and increase the efficiency of the breastfeeding. So that's the sort of thing you can imagine it being involved with. Okay, so now we move to the anterior pituitary. And the anterior pituitary is just a mass of different kinds of hormones that are released. And here's the whole list. And there's only one here that I'm not going to discuss in any detail, and that's this melanocyte stimulating hormone. We won't worry about. The others, I do want you to at least know where they operate and something about what the effects of the hormone are. I will just say one thing that we're not going to discuss in any great detail, but all of these, and you see, are released in response to stimulation from the hypothalamus. But the hypothalamus also can release inhibiting hormones. So the hypothalamus really exerts very, very fine control over the amount of hormone which is produced by the pituitary or by any other endocrine gland in the body. So here, those are our posterior hormones, okay, which we've already talked about: antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin. Now we're going to remember these 6 for the anterior pituitary, and they are thyroid stimulating hormone. Guess where it operates? Thyroid stimulating hormone acts on the thyroid and gets thyroid to release thyroxine or thyroid hormone, which raises the metabolism of the body. It will raise the temperature, for example. And we saw that before when in response to cold, we looked at that feedback mechanism whereby thyroid hormone ended up being released, and as it raised the body temperature, so the release of thyroid stimulating hormone gets shut down by a negative feedback loop. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. I know it's a mouthful to remember, but just remember it operates on the adrenal cortex, a part of the adrenal gland which sits above your kidney. and it causes this part of the adrenal gland to release hormones in response to long-term stress, not to the short-term fight or flight kind of thing, which adrenaline or epinephrine does. But these hormones released because of this are hormones for long-term, dealing with long-term stress. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, we're going to hear quite a bit about, because these hormones are very intimately involved with reproduction and with managing, for example, the menstrual cycle and pregnancy and everything else, but also in men, the generation of sperm and of testosterone. That's the involvement. Follicle stimulating hormone, you'll see why, and luteinizing. Luteinizing means yellowing, and you'll see why that it gets that name when we talk a bit more about reproduction. This hormone here, growth hormone, this is a hormone which has its effect on virtually all of the cells of the body. And growth hormone, as its name implies, is the hormone which produces the development post-puberty, but is also very much involved with development even earlier on in the body. And this prolactin is a hormone which leads to the actual production of milk in the breast, not to its release, but to its production. Oxytocin is involved with its release, stimulating smooth muscle. Prolactin actually gets the cells of the breast to produce the milk in the first place. So you'll notice a difference. These four, that one there, that, and that, these four all operate on another endocrine gland. So they actually get a special name. They get called tropic hormones because they stimulate another gland to produce the final product. These two here, growth hormone and prolactin, these operate directly. They are released by the pituitary, by the anterior pituitary, and they have their operation directly on the cells of the body, not with an intermediary hormone. Okay, so here they are here. So this is the way it works. Remember that the posterior pituitary, we saw that it was just a highway for the release of hypothalamic hormones. Now, the hypothalamus, in response to whatever stimulation, will cause the release of releasing hormones. And these releasing hormones go to the bloodstream, very short trip through the bloodstream to the cells of the anterior pituitary. And it's the cells of the anterior pituitary that then produce the final pituitary hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone with their target, the gonads, principally. Thyroid stimulating hormone, target, the thyroid. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, the adrenal cortex. That's prolactin, the breast, to stimulate milk production. Don't worry about melanocyte stimulating hormone, we won't talk about it. And then growth hormone, which has its effect globally throughout the body, depending on the stage of life. It can have effects throughout the body, on all of the tissues of the body. Sorry, I seem to be stuck. Okay, here we are. This is basically just a summary of what I've told you. We do want, however, we're going to spend a little bit of time here talking about, sorry, I just need to do something. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about, especially about these hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, because these are hormones which are intimately involved with the development, with sexual development, and then with reproduction itself. And this little thing that biologists will tell you, there are during the development of a vertebrate, there are a few really critical events, and the first one is of course fertilization itself. Fertilization is a random chance meeting between a random egg and a random sperm to produce, as we talked about before, an absolutely unique genetic combination in the fertilized egg or the zygote. As the zygote develops into the fetus, etc. So fertilization is the very first critical event. If that doesn't happen, no existence arises. The second one, well, I'm not going to describe, but it's an event very shortly after fertilization. The zygote divides, and when it gets to a certain number of cells, an incredible thing happens, that the whole thing folds in on itself and folds in a very complex set of events called gastrulation. And there are many things that can go wrong in gastrulation. And if things do go wrong in gastrulation, very often that embryo will actually be aborted. And this is quite a frequent occurrence because gastrulation is a very complex process and an essential process for development. We're not going to talk about it, just be aware that you successfully passed through gastrulation, and that's how you are here. The next critical event is one that probably you remember well, and that is this. It's puberty. Puberty is a cataclysmic event in developmental terms. A massive number of changes take place in the body during puberty as we pass from non-reproductive to reproductive status. And the body is taken from immaturity, very suddenly pushed through the rest of its maturation quite quickly, with a huge input of hormones of all sorts. And if you want to just think of one thing, think about how we undergo a growth spurt during puberty. That growth spurt is because of the release of growth hormone from the pituitary. And it is in response to all sorts of other cues and events that are occurring. And biologists will tell you that of these 4 events here, there are 2 that have usually have the desired outcome, and that is puberty, usually pretty successful, even though it might be a little bit miserable to go through sometimes. The other, unfortunately, is death, because everything must die. All living things must die. If not, if we carried on living forever, all the Earth's resources would end up being put into living things, and everything would grind to a halt. Death, unfortunately, is an intimate part of living, and things die so that other things can live. So we're going to spend a little bit of time. We won't talk about death anymore. We will talk about puberty. So puberty is a strange situation. Well, let's say a strange situation pertains prior to puberty, because it's as if your hypothalamus, from the time that you are an infant, is continually trying to push you through puberty. And the hypothalamus is continually producing a hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone. And that gonadotropin releasing hormone acts on the anterior pituitary to produce luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And those hormones will go to the gonads, to the ovaries and the testes. They will get the ovaries to produce estrogen, and they'll get the testes to produce testosterone. But here's the thing. Before puberty, the hypothalamus is exquisitely sensitive to the presence of these hormones, estrogen in the female, testosterone in the male. And immediately, even a small amount appears, it shuts down the release of gonadotrophin releasing hormone. So the development of ovary and the development of the testis just doesn't take place because the hypothalamus responds to a negative feedback and shuts down development. It shuts down the release of this, so no more LH, no more FSH are released, no more development, no more production of testosterone, and none of the effects of those appear. But as puberty approaches, the hypothalamus itself changes. The sensitivity of the hypothalamus to the presence of these sex hormones is reduced. The hypothalamus becomes less and less sensitive, so that what happens now is it begins to release gonadotrophin releasing hormone. The pituitary successfully releases luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And now, instead of being shut down, in fact, there's a bit of a positive feedback. The hypothalamus begins to produce more in response to seeing sex hormone. And we get a cascade all of a sudden, in the female, the estrogen levels of the body suddenly begin to rise very high. In the male, the testosterone levels begin to rise very, very high. And these produce all of the impacts of puberty. There is also a growth spurt, and at the same time, the body begins to develop the secondary sex characteristics that result from the presence of circulating sex hormones in the body. And very, very importantly, the males will begin to produce sperm, and they do that in response to the presence of luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone. And in the females, the female ovary begins to prepare for its first ovulation, for the maturation and the release of an egg in the first ovulation that takes place. So these are all the cataclysmic events of puberty. At the same time, you'll realize these hormones don't only have somatic or bodily effects, they also have psychological effects. And they produce all sorts of, they have all sorts of impacts on behavior and everything else, which you probably remember well. Okay, so the one thing which is really important for us to discuss is the way in which female humans become fertile, and then what happens if fertility does not actually lead to a pregnancy. And human beings have a cycle. A female has a cycle which is approximately 28 days between one ovulation and the next. To about 28 days, and not strictly 28 days, but it's about 28 days. And you probably know well that cycle is marked by a period of what appears to be bleeding from the vagina. What it actually is the shedding of the lining of the uterus, which is done every month. The uterus wall is prepared for a fertilized egg to implant in it. And if no egg implants, then that preparation is shed. That formation on the inside of the uterus is called the endometrium. And the endometrium is shed once a month if no fertilization has taken place. This whole cycle is in response to a hormonal dance between hormones which are being released by the gonads themselves, by the ovaries themselves, and hormones which are released by the hypothalamus and the pituitary. It is literally a dance between them, those hormones, which leads to the development of the endometrium, the ovulation, and then the shedding of the endometrium if no fertilization takes place. So we recognize different phases to the menstrual cycle. And it's always counted from day one of bleeding. And the bleeding can take in between 3 and 7 days. There's a lot of variability in menstrual cycles from woman to woman. And in fact, from menstrual cycles, a menstrual cycle may differ as well. There are all sorts of inputs which can modulate hormonal structures and everything as the cycle proceeds. So we have 3 to 7 days of bleeding as the endometrium is shed. And then once the endometrium is shed, then the whole cycle begins again. And the first thing the first part of the cycle is called the follicular phase. And that is because it's largely governed by development of a follicle on the ovary. That follicle on the ovary actually acts as a little endocrine gland all on its own and releases hormones, which feed back to the hypothalamus and instruct the hypothalamus about what the status of ovulation. This lasts approximately 16 days, and at its culmination is when that follicle on the ovary bursts and it releases the egg. And that is the occurrence of ovulation. Now that follicle is really important because once it's released the egg, it kind of heals up and it forms another little endocrine organ. And you'll see it again in a minute. And that healed up follicle releases hormones and pushes the body now through what we call the luteal phase. And you'll see why it's called the luteal phase in a minute. And this is when the endometrium really develops fully. It's preparing for implantation of this egg, which has been released and the body hopes has been fertilized. But if at the end this egg is not fertilized, then the whole system shuts down. The endometrium is no longer supported and it's shed from the wall of the uterus again. Again, we enter back into the stage of menstruation. Now, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about the interaction of the different hormones, but I just want you to have some basic understanding about how this is all accomplished. Let's have a look first. This is in the ovary itself. In the ovary, each month, there's actually something of a competition between different follicles. They actually do sort of kind of interact in a way. Usually, not always, but usually only one follicle ends up maturing each 28 days. And as it's maturing, this follicle is releasing small amounts of estrogen. It actually acts as an endocrine gland. It releases small amounts of estrogen, which feed to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus gets the pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And as this follicle matures, so there is actually a positive feedback. The pituitary ends up producing more and more and more follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Have a look here, and you'll see that this is driving the development of this, and this is driving the production of follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. The estrogen is being produced by the follicle itself. So it's being matured by luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And in response, it is producing estrogen. And that estrogen is driving the production of more luteinizing hormone and more follicle stimulating hormone. And it reaches a critical point around about here when the follicle actually bursts and the egg is ejected from the follicle. Immediately that happens, there's a decrease in the amount of estrogen produced, a crash in the amount of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. But now, so this here, up to there, is the follicular phase of the follicular, because it's all dependent on the follicle itself. This follicle does not just disappear. It heals up and forms this. It's called the corpus luteum. And it is filled with these yellow colored cells. And it is actually an endocrine gland all on its own. And it produces estrogen, some, and it produces this hormone here called progesterone. And estrogen and progesterone together strongly stimulate the production of the endometrium there. So this corpus luteum here is preparing the uterus to receive this fertilized egg here. If no pregnancy results, if there's no implanted fertilized egg, the corpus luteum can't be maintained, because the corpus luteum is actually maintained by hormones produced by the placenta. If there's no placenta, then the corpus luteum just withers away. It regresses, and it stops producing estrogen. It stops producing progesterone completely. And under those conditions, the endometrium cannot be sustained. And now the endometrium is shed. And here is the period of bleeding, of menstruation. And now we're back. We're back to one successful follicle developing over the next period of time, another corpus luteum, another shedding of the endometrium in a bleed, and back into another cycle. It's a dance. It is a dance between the hormones of the ovary itself and the hormones of the hypothalamus and of the pituitary as well. So now here is the summary of the events for you. And just use the diagram before and use this to get memorized. Now, how the body knows if a pregnancy has resulted, because the placenta itself acts as an endocrine gland. And as the placenta develops, it releases this hormone, beta human chorionic gonadotrophin, beta HCG, beta human chorionic gonadotropin. And that allows this corpus luteum to be maintained. And as long as the corpus luteum is maintained, it will produce progesterone and estrogen at these levels here, and it will maintain the endometrium, placenta, and everything else for the duration of the pregnancy. There are a couple of extra things that do start to happen, but largely the pregnancy is maintained. You can just remember that the pregnancy is actually maintained by the placenta acting as an endocrine gland all on its own. But there's one other thing to think about, and that is As long as these levels here of progesterone and estrogen are high, they have another effect, and that is to suppress the development of a new follicle. No new follicle is going to develop as long as the corpus luteum is secreting progesterone and estrogen. So this actually gives us an opportunity for contraception, for interrupting the whole cycle and preventing ovulation and preventing any pregnancy from occurring. And most oral contraceptives in women go for this period here. And what they do is they provide a woman with an exogenous, an outside source of sex hormones, progesterone, estrogen, and they don't maintain as this higher level is not necessary, but there is a critical level of concentration in the blood. As long as that is present in the blood, then no maturation takes place. So the way that most oral contraceptives are formulated is that they maintain a certain level of endometrium. It's not full endometrial development on the uterus. And then at the end, so you take pills for 23 days or whatever, no ovulation will take place because these levels are high. The body thinks that there's a corpus luteum active. And then after 23 days or whatever, the pill is changed and is actually it's basically sugar pills. They contain no hormone at all for a couple of days. And when that happens, the hormone levels plummet like this, and a bleed results. But before follicular development can begin, the woman will start taking the hormones again and quickly push the levels back up. And then no further development of an ovary, of a follicle will take place. And in this way, they can avoid pregnancy because no ovulation ever takes place. No egg is ever released. So this is how the oral contraceptives are formulated. There is a question to ask, though, and that is it absolutely necessary to have a bleed here? Is menstruation actually necessary? When human birth control pills were first formulated, they actually surveyed women. Now, don't forget, this was in the 1960s. And they asked women, they said, do you want to have menstruation once a month where you bleed or not? And the vast majority of women said yes. They thought that menstruation was a natural process and they didn't want to interrupt what they often saw as a hallmark of womanhood, basically, kind of thing. If you do that same survey nowadays, where most women have a career, everything else, and menstruation is actually a nuisance, more of a nuisance than anything else, the majority of women now will answer and say no, they do not. If they could avoid menstruation, they would do so. There is no reason why this has to happen. The pill can be formulated so that it maintains continual levels high enough to suppress both follicular development and, if you keep it high, to avoid menstruation itself. And that is an ongoing controversy as to whether that should be done or not. This is just to summarize for you. It explains to you more or less exactly how this oral contraception works. Now, here's something of real interest. And this is this idea that was realized that women who were breastfeeding as long as they were breastfeeding, they had a reduced chance of falling pregnant. It was purely observation made through the ages that breastfeeding reduced fertility. The reason for that is that hormone prolactin is a hormone which is released in response to pregnancy, but then after birth, prolactin is released, and in order to stimulate milk production. But prolactin actually suppresses the production of luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone. And with no luteinizing hormone, follicular stimulating hormone, let me just show you. If you have no follicular stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, then this doesn't take place. No, there's no maturation of a follicle, and no ovulation takes place. And in fact, there's no menstrual cycle at all. And this is called lactational amenorrhea. It is a suppression of the whole menstrual cycle while the woman is breastfeeding, and it's because of the release of prolactin into the blood. So this is actually a viable contraceptive method, but a very, 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 very poor one. And people who try to use lactational amenorrhea, lactational contraception, are very often unsuccessful, and there's a very high rate of pregnancy amongst people trying this. Well, this is something of some considerable interest, because it seems like as long as you're breastfeeding, you are producing prolactin, and you should be able to suppress the production of luteinizing hormone, etc. So there's some question: why didn't this work? Why did it fail so often? Well, for an answer, we need to go to people like this. These are Khoisan people in Southern Africa, in the Kalahari. And they lead a very interesting lifestyle. They are nomadic people. And there are a couple of things about the upbringing of their children. First of all, children will feed from any woman. And as long as the woman is regularly feeding a child, she will continue to produce milk. And as long as she's producing milk, she's going to be producing prolactin. And in examining lifestyles of the Khoisan, scientists were amazed to find that women in the Khoisan only menstruate about 4 or 5 times in their entire lifetime. This is extraordinary. Western women menstruate 12 times a year about. Khoisan only 4 or 5 times in their entire lifespan. They could not. How was this possible? And the answer lies in the way in which they breastfeed. First of all, as I told you, a woman can breastfeed anyone's child. So she may continually be breastfeeding not only her own babies, her own children, but others as well. Second of all, children breastfeed until they are 5, 6. So not all the time. They don't depend on breastfeeding completely, but it is something that they do, something they continue to do, even when they're quite mature. And the third thing, which turned out to be the most important thing of all, was that women have infants near them the whole time, day and night. And infants will feed even when the woman is asleep. So a woman may be fed from every 20 minutes or so. She is continually breastfeeding, and that is the answer to this conundrum. They actually have relatively few children. they have relatively few children because they maintain this amenorrhea, absence of menstruation, due to breastfeeding for a very, very long time. And their lives are only interrupted every now and again when they do stop breastfeeding. As soon as they stop breastfeeding, even for a short time, they immediately move into a menstrual cycle. They immediately ovulate, and very often they will fall pregnant with that ovulation. And then they've got another span of many years of breastfeeding when they will not fall pregnant again. And it's an exquisite way in which this the population is maintained at a low level. This countryside does not sustain a high population. And in addition, the women themselves have very few menstrual cycles, and menstrual cycles are associated with adverse outcomes. In actual fact, it turns out that it may be more beneficial to have fewer rather than more. So with this kind of thing in mind, well, we may need to reconstruct our oral contraceptives. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about male sperm production, everything in males. I just want you to know that the same two hormones, luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone, operate on the testes to do two things. First of all, to stimulate sperm production. Sperm production is stimulated by follicular stimulating hormone and testosterone. And testosterone production is governed by luteinizing hormone. Here you will see it called ICSH, interstitial cell stimulating hormone. It's luteinizing hormone. It's the same thing. It's just that in the male, it's given a different name, interstitial cell stimulating hormone. And interstitial cell stimulating hormone stimulates cells of the testes which release testosterone. So the testosterone together with follicular stimulating hormone causes the production of sperm. The same two hormones in the male operate to produce sperm and testosterone. In the female, they govern the menstrual cycle. Okay, so just briefly, I want to just tell you that there's a lot of endocrine activity that results from endocrine activity of other organs, and some of them really surprising. For example, there are cells of the heart which are endocrine. They release hormones which act on the kidney to regulate blood pressure. So the heart, as it beats, is actually monitoring the blood pressure. And in response to changes in blood pressure, it releases hormones which act on the kidney to regulate blood volume, which in itself regulates the blood pressure. The gastrointestinal tract, all the way from the stomach and then down through the gastrointestinal tract, that releases hormones which are largely governed, or largely concerned with the sense of hunger and the satiety, that is being full, because you should not be eating beyond that. We in Western societies train ourselves to eat far too much. But under normal circumstances, those sensations of hunger and being full, those are actually generated by hormones from the gut. The kidneys themselves are endocrine glands, and they interact especially with the adrenal glands to regulate blood pressure. But the kidneys also release hormones which produce the sensation of thirst. And that is so that we take in fluids which can then be put into the blood circulatory system to raise blood pressure. So the sense of thirst is generated by hormones from the kidneys. And also, very, very surprisingly, the kidney has hormones which interact with the bone marrow and govern the production of blood corpuscles. the probably one of it's sometimes said the largest endocrine organ for the body is actually the skin, and that is because the skin produces vitamin D, and it releases vitamin D as a hormone, and it causes calcium to be taken up from the intestine. And this is a little dance, a little hormonal dance that is done between skin producing vitamin D, which causes hormones, which cause the parathyroids to operate and take up calcium. And if you want 1% extra credit, go and look up this story here. How does the skin interact with the parathyroids interact with the parathyroids in order to regulate calcium content of the blood? It's a simple story, and if 1% extra credit, if you get that to me before your final exam. Okay, so with that finishes that, and our next topic on Wednesday is going to be on human evolution. I'm going to finish off our last three classes discussing human evolution with you. Okay,